All right, so tribes are essentially individuals that utilize hunting and gathering and foraging, just like band level societies, but they're larger in size. They usually have permanent village sites, so they're not moving around constantly like bands. Um, they also, in this kind of time period, um, which is kind of 12,000 to 10,000. And really, we could back these dates up a little bit. It's probably more like 15,000 to kind of 10,000 at certain parts of the world. They start gardening, which is horticulture, and they also start utilizing animal husbandry, which is domestication of animals. So again, larger in population, usually tribes kind of get into the thousands range, and you get more permanent villages. Um, they appear when the climate starts to warm and get wetter, so it's more in tune to growing food. And really, what tribes are is a combination of several bands, right? Like people figure out that coming together for festivals and ceremonies with bands, that they can do that permanently, and adding more people to the workforce um, also is a positive for this group in terms of tribes. What I will say about band level societies is in terms of the work week, they only worked about 10 to 15 hours a week. And that was essentially food production and gathering food. The rest of the time was pretty leisure. Once you add in horticulture and pastoralism, you're essentially bound to that kind of work. So your work week definitely gets more intense. So you're looking at more probably 25 to 40-hour work weeks. Um, and they're mostly egalitarian. They could be led by, in certain levels of tribes, you could be led by a headman, which is a temporary leader, um, which would kind of solve conflicts, whether it be around harvest or whatnot. And then if it's a bigger tribe level, then we would probably call them a big man society, which is permanent leadership. It's also big man, big woman, so it could be a female as well. That's the other thing about up until this point, females had a lot of power within band level societies, tribes, and also the big men, big woman structure. Um, and you earned your role through kind of personal achievements, generosity, conflict resolution, and maybe war. And essentially, what it is a level of prestige because maybe you know something, you know how to fix a problem, and you get prestige that way. And then the group basically elects you. And big men are not like headmen. Big men are lifetime appointments. Headmen are temporary. So that's kind of the distinction here, right? When we get into chiefdoms, we definitely have horticulture, pastoralism, and we're moving into agriculture. Remember, when we have horticulture and agriculture, we're moving into also kind of a version of private property, ownership of land. At first, horticulture with tribal level people was still egalitarian, was communally run. But in chiefdoms, horticulture and agriculture start to, and pastoralism. Pastoralism is different in that people own the animals. So we're moving in from commons and no ownership into private ownership and property. So under chiefdoms, this also is we move into more of an androcentricity or androcentric society, which is male centric or male dominated in terms of hierarchy. And chiefdoms are composed of a number of villages and communities. So now you have small kind of that might have been tribes united by one individual leader who inherits power. So what happens is sometimes is big men societies turn into chiefdoms because they don't want to just give up the power and not pass it on. Chiefdoms essentially are passing on their power to their son usually, and it's inherited. And you can see that this is kind of how kingships and kingdoms actually operate as well. Um, they also would have utilized religious rituals and beliefs often serve to empower them or give more power to them. So that's also kind of another point to their process, which is not only do they rule because they are the enforcer of laws, they also rule over kind of the afterlife as well. So we're starting to move into that kind of what we would call divine king, which is what kind of Europeans did for a long time. Um, the problem with chiefdoms is that colonialism might have messed up this whole process. And what I mean by that is the colonial interaction is a lot of times missionaries showed up and they just expected every group to be ordered in at least chiefdoms because they had been exposed to that in places like Africa and Asia and some of that stuff. So they just didn't. They just thought that a chief or a male leader was always in charge. So a lot of times when they met groups, they would say, I want to talk to your leader, and that would be negotiated out. And essentially, some groups even put females forward because they were in charge. And the male missionaries would say, no, 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 I want to talk to the man in charge. So then they would push a man forward and they said, oh, this is your chief. So then essentially that individual gets deemed a chief. And so I think that realizing that the colonial structure is that cultural imperialism, you're basically adding this hierarchy to a group of people that didn't have that hierarchy or that exact hierarchy before you showed up, but it's because what you thought should exist. And then because that individual is seen as the chief from this outside group, the inside group starts to actually recognize that individual as that person too. It's not complicated, but it's definitely like one of those human things in terms of kind of a George Herbert Mead formation of self and identity structure. All right, then we move into feudal societies where we get into strict hierarchy. This is a picture of kind of serfdoms in the back or serfships in the back, and then kind of lords, and this would be kind of more of a Russian picture, kind of indicating a feudal society. Power is based in land ownership. So again, the feudal lords would have owned the land. The serfs would have essentially been land workers that are stuck to the land. They're essentially indentured servants where, food and shelter are taken care of, but you're really stuck to the lord, and there's a lot of kind of debt that is associated with that. It's almost a slave structure, but it's around work and again around some different kind of debt structure. Lords put vassals in charge of the land, so again it's more like land managers. And again, the land would be referred to as fiefdoms, farmed by serfs and peasants. And then we get into kind of the idea here of a scribe status and a chief status. And we talked about that earlier, actually. With headman and big man, that's definitely an achieved status, right? You have to gain the prestige. It's like our president or elected officials. We elect them. They gain that power through us. A scribe status is when it's passed down through bloodline. And you don't really have to do anything for it. All you have to do is be born. So this is the problem with the feudal societies, is that born into power structure. State and agriculture. State requires to have a state. You definitely have to have agriculture. Otherwise, there's no reason to have a state. So I kind of differentiate between different types of states. One would be an ancient state. Here I have kind of Egypt, 5,000 years ago, Mesopotamia. And you can see kind of the pyramid within the pyramid, the structure of who has power in the hierarchy, right? So the pharaoh's on top, and then you have kind of his advisors, and then you have nobles and priests, and then you have scribes and soldiers, craftsmen, and all the way down at the bottom are basically your agricultural workers, peasants, the peasant class. Most states, modern states, come into being after World War II. Prior to that, we had a lot of mixtures of kind of ancient states and different kind of nation structures. Currently, there are 196 independent states. So when I say modern states, we're more talking about kind of currently what the system is, right? Like lots of democracies, adding in a little bit more kind of individual right and self-expression and some of those other things. No one person is the law, right? In modern states, the law is written, and there's a law enforcement structure. So again, there's kind of a division here, right? If you can divide up where, like Egypt, the pharaoh was definitely kind of the law, right? And there was a law that was written, but the pharaoh was definitely enforcement of that. It wasn't law. There is not a separate law enforcement structure. So this is due to the multiplicity of microcultures within their own norms, right? So the only way that the state can actually gain control is through things like law and religious ideology and some of those other kind of political connectedness structures that exist in society in order to bring together different groups that have very different ideas about the world. And again, America is a perfect example of that. There's a lot of people with subcultures that don't have the same viewpoints, but are brought under the umbrella of this giant kind of society, America, and this macro culture. Constant change through individuals, groups, and social movements is also some of the things that current modern states have to deal with. So that would be our amendment structure, the ability to make new law within our own kind of government structure as well. Then we start to move into mass industrial agriculture. So spatialization of the state, we start to encompass all aspects of culture. So the state starts to encompass everything. Also start to monetize and bring things that used to not be in the economic realm into the economic realm. Um, and interactions then start to be one of those things of that can cost money, right? So currently talking on your cell phone can cost money. There's data plans, there's all those things. And essentially we're, in the old days, we didn't have phones. Personal communication to each other didn't necessarily cost money, but we've tried to even create that structure where we can kind of sell products to individuals as a version of that communication. Mail delivery system, taxes, jury duty, passports, all those things become vital components of being a state citizen. Max Weber states that that actually the entity of a state has a monopoly or legitimate use of force. So the state itself is the only one that can use force, and we as citizens recognize that they have that power. Hegemony or hegemony, you'll hear it both ways. This is a term used when we talk about kind of more of a global state or a state level system, which is the ability to dominate a group, to create consent and agreement within a population without the use or threat of force. So this is, some people put propaganda in this. Hegemony is a little bit more powerful than just looking at a poster, right? Hegemony is kind of convincing and using maybe your place in society, if you have kind of prestige, to get people to do what you want them to do. Nationalism as a tool to create the perception of shared unity, right? This is Imagined Communities. Benedict Anderson is kind of a major component here, which is symbols, structures, laws, government. Those things are what bring us together in terms of a nation. Neoliberalism is kind of breaking down a certain level of the state power, but it's not necessarily giving up their power. What it's doing is letting the economic free market, the world kind of structure of capitalism, do its thing and dictate rules and or norms for people worldwide. And neoliberalism, you'll hear that term a lot. It's essentially deregulation, lowering taxes, letting people have more freedom within the economic sphere is really what neoliberalism on an international level. NGOs are non-government organizations, and a lot of them are involved in activism and helping other people out. And it's basically where the state is not serving a function and or helping people out. NGOs will be there to do that work. So theoretical orientations, I kind of went over a lot of these already. Functionalism is Durkheim associated, hint, 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 right? Conflict theory, Karl Marx. Symbolic interactionism is Max Weber. But more so, we're going to talk about George Herbert Mead here for symbolic interactionism. Social constructivism is the idea that we can actually construct society. Human beings do and have forever. So it's the idea of kind of reverse engineering that social constructiveness, right? So what is it that brought us together and enabled this whole society to start coming together and working in these different parts? And that to kind of Durkheim's points, it's functional on a certain level. But social constructivism is one of those things, one of those theories about like classroom culture, right? Social constructivists would look at how it is to form a specific kind of culture group using some of their own social constructivist theories. Functionalism. So when we get into functionalism, the knit and grit of functionalism itself is really looking at, again, how it is that things are brought together. Herbert Spencer believed that society is like an organism, right? And this example is a pretty good one. If society is like a body, human beings are like cells, and human beings all go off to places or institutions of work, right? So institutions like the economy or our government or some of these other bigger things would be the organs of the body, and those require cells to actually make them work. So that's kind of Herbert Spencer's ideas around some of those things. Herbert Spencer, definitely in the sociology realm, also coins the term survival of the fittest as it has to do with society. He's taking Darwinian evolution and applying it to culture in a wrong way, actually. Durkheim gives us the elementary forms of religious life. This is kind of one of the books. And he talks about the sacred versus the profane. Sacred being holy, profane being not holy, like brushing your teeth.